They might have a mix of revenue. They may have a SaaS offering that's doing some of the lifting. They may also have some solutions, or it's SaaS, but it's also some consulting for the bigger enterprise customers. Can you speak a little bit about, your experience in, enterprise versus mid-market and how deal size affects the product and the business? How would you say that AI is changing, what it takes to grow a product now? I mean, I feel like we're recording this in 2026, and in the early part of the year, it may be totally different next year. But right now, what do you feel like the impact is?
The challenge comes that it creates some challenges for the organization. The features that enterprises demand tend to be more complex. The process of landing those deals is that purchase cycle is much, much longer. And it creates ongoing support costs that people don't necessarily think about upfront.
Jonathan, welcome to Product Growth Stories. I'm so excited to have you on the show. And man, you have had an extensive career at American Express, Herman, and I'd love to dive into some of the lessons that you've learned in your journey. Let's start right away with something that I think a lot of founders deal with, especially as they're trying to break out of this initial success. You get your business to 1 or 2 million, something works. And what are the barriers that you see to growth velocity?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I've seen a bunch. And I see what happens is that, what got you there doesn't get you to the next level. You hear that a lot, and people think about the product, product discovery and product market fit. And that's important for sure. But what I've also seen is that internally there are things that are happening that are maybe holding you back, right? So things such as, you talk a lot about product velocity, and that creates a lot of frustration inside the organization. Some of that is about communication, some of that is about technical issues, but really looking at that and diagnosing it and removing some of those barriers really allows you to then grow and expand.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear some of the concrete examples that you can think of. I'm thinking about some people I've worked with in that space, in that area, where there's something holding them back. And to me, it always comes down to beliefs. Like somewhere the founder has a belief that's blocking the behavior that would be the most effective at that point in time, but it shows up everywhere. How do you see it?
Yeah, the influence of the founder is huge for sure, right? They come in, they've gotten it this far, and they have a lot of conviction about that. The truth is that as the company grows, the founder needs to be doing other things, and they can't be in the day-to-day. And the other interesting thing is, I think in any organization, but particularly small ones, everyone has an opinion, right? Everyone thinks
Yeah.
that, hey, the head of growth just talked to, or a salesperson just talked to a customer, and the customer says, we absolutely need to do this. When can we do it, right? And that's a challenge. Part of managing that challenge is making sure that everyone gets to feel heard, gets to have their input considered, but not constantly pivoting and shifting gears, and getting people out of the weeds so that the teams can work. It's something that I hear all the time from engineering teams is, let me do my work. Don't keep interrupting me, right? So
Yes.
we're trying to manage that challenge and that balance. So that, and then the other part of it is, going back to the velocity. So if you can take more swings at bat, each of those conversations, the temperature goes down. If you only get to make one big decision this year, one big decision this quarter, you're going to fight really hard about what that decision is. If you can do it more than once, if you can do it multiple times, right, it's a little bit easier to say, you know what, we'll do this, but we'll also do that. Or let us do this first because we will get.
So it sounds a little bit that part of the solution in your mind is enabling smaller bets, right? So it's not absolutely mission critical that you get your
Yeah.
point through as long as you have a way to get data that, it could be a potential avenue to growth, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you need to take big swings, right? I'm not saying that,
Mm.
but being able to take more of those smaller swings really unlocks the velocity. It changes the whole dynamic of the conversation. One of the, even though we didn't quite get there in the last place I worked, we went from probably releasing every 10 weeks when I started to doing a weekly deployment, which meant that each of those changes all of a sudden, right, became a lot more doable. And you can imagine, deploying once every 10 weeks, basically means you get, half a dozen or a dozen chances to do something in a year at best. Sometimes it's less than that because we had, if you make a mistake, that means that product lifecycle or that feature lifecycle might be 2 or 3 iterations long, right? That's half a year right there.
Yeah.
Versus being able to do, maybe 20 plus bets or 20 plus iterations in that same time period.
Yeah, I love that. I'm just thinking about, I'm sure you were thinking about the Dora metrics and all of Google's work in there. And I've seen this as well. When you have a team that's, yeah, when the problems you have to solve to get from where you were saying like months to release down to weeks, you have to solve so many problems and it makes the releases less stressful. By the time you get it down to a week, it's no big deal to roll out incremental updates. Whereas before, it's like, well, what if we break it for the customer? There's all these risks that you haven't, or scenarios that you haven't ironed out, preventing
For
you.
sure. And part of that, and we felt it every time we did a deployment, it would take us anywhere, we would get to the end of a sprint and then it would take us anywhere from a day or two to maybe 10 days to get that deployment into production, because we had the stress of testing it and regression testing it and doing all of those steps every single time. And then if there was a problem, the backlash that we would get from the rest of the organization made, each of those events really stressful. When we went to weekly deployments, part of that was, hey, you know what? Most of the time, if something goes wrong, we've got the next fix is right behind, right? So it's very easy. And then we established this culture of fail forward, that most things could be fixed in the next deployment rather than having to roll back, even though we always had a way to roll back. And so, part of the goals that we set for ourselves as we did that was that we could do a deployment, in, maybe a couple of hours as opposed to days or even more than a week.
And how does that transformation relate to growth? I think a lot of the marketing thinking and the operational thinking can be really disconnected. People think about like, well, this is the just running the ship is all that's happening there in operations. But can you speak to a little bit how that might impact the growth potential for a product?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it allowed us to do more things, to try more things. We were operating in the enterprise space, so a lot of our customers were big enterprise customers, and they had been waiting for, one is they'd been waiting for features for a long time, but the other is, they were asking for enterprise features, things like SSO, things like SOC 2 compliance, things like, hey, we're a global organization, we need these features to be available in more languages. And it created space to be able to do those, in addition to also working on the core product and the core experience, which we ultimately needed to do both, right? And we were able to, by having more chances to do that, we were able to go after more of those things.
I love that. Yeah. And when a lot of companies hit this, they climb this initial mountain to a few million per year and they're looking to scale, they might have a mix of revenue. They may have a SaaS offering that's doing some of the lifting. They may also have some solutions, or it's SaaS, but it's also some consulting for the bigger enterprise customers. Can you speak a little bit about, your experience in, enterprise versus mid-market and how deal size affects the product and the business?
Oh, it's huge. We tend to think of B2B SaaS, or a lot of people tend to put all B2B SaaS together.
Mm.
Enterprise and mid-market are really different businesses with different dynamics. The great thing about enterprise is the deals are big, and once you get them, they give you a good financial cushion. And once you're in, you get something of a moat, right? You get to stay in for a while. So that's fantastic. The flip side, and also, sales teams love them, right? Because the commission's on, a deal that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, or, multi-year deals is fantastic. The challenge comes that it creates some challenges for the organization. The features that enterprises demand tend to be more complex. The process of landing those deals that purchase cycle is much, much longer. And it creates ongoing support costs that people don't necessarily think about upfront. When we introduced SSO, the first go round of SSO wasn't that hard for smaller organizations. But when we got to the enterprise, each one was effectively a project, because each enterprise did SSO just a little bit differently, right? And we had to
Yeah.
coordinate with IT teams in 3 different locations, and it could take months. So we ended up spending more time on supporting or fully implementing those features at the enterprise level than we actually did building them out in the first place. And that ongoing tax is a different dynamic. So one of the conversations that we would have with the growth teams is, we really need to price that in when people are buying those enterprise features, right? And not just kind of do it as because it's table stakes, we're just going to throw it into their formula.
Yeah.
So on the nice thing about the mid-market is it's also a little bit easier to experiment and try new things. The change management tends to be a little bit easier. The big organizations, that's the other issue. We had this constant tension between, hey, I want new features, but they're coming too fast and we can't figure them out quickly though.
Do it, but don't. Yeah. Yeah. And I was just thinking that from a marketing point of view and a product marketing point of view, mid market gives you shorter feedback loop. It's
Yeah.
easier to, maybe it's 3 months to find a net new person and bring them in. And that gives you enough time that you can really optimize a lot in a year. Whereas enterprise seems like so much harder to have a short feedback loop. Have you found any ways to improve the feedback loop in terms of just marketing products to the enterprise?
I mean, it is harder for sure. And one of the things that part of what we ended up having to do is to find find the stakeholders in those enterprises. And it was honestly, it was a multi-step process. When you're selling to an enterprise, you're selling usually to a lot of different stakeholders with different needs. At Herman, we were selling to the learning and development teams in large organizations or to the HR organizations, but they in turn were essentially using this in either in some cases transfer pricing internally, in other cases they were buying, but also thinking about how they were rolling out programs. But they also had to contend with IT teams and InfoSec teams and accessibility teams and other people who were going to review that decision. And we needed to speak to all of those. So, what we did, we did I'd say a lot of the classic things that people do. We would hold webinars. We had our marketing materials. It was a lot of a consultative sale type of a process. The other thing that worked well is creating champions, although in some ways it's a little bit of it's kind of got two sides. So the model is that we would train internal practitioners and they would become advocates for the product and they would use the product, which was great. And they really were advocates because they understood the value of what we were doing. The challenges goes back to that change management, because now every time we had to make a change, they needed to get on board because they were not comfortable sharing it out with the next group of people if they were not up to speed on it. So it
Mhm.
also slowed the pace of change and communication.
Yeah, it seems, at the end of the day, no matter what you're doing, if it's technology, there's like a human being somewhere, and they have to change their behavior for anything to happen. And that's, to me, this is the hardest part for anything in business. It's just making sure that those other people are able to, really get the most out of these things.
Yeah, and even with, everything going on now and AI, and certainly AI, sets the bar higher for a lot of functionality and features, the change management is still there, right? It's still
Mhm.
a challenge. And the larger the organization, the bigger the change management, becomes a thing, right? Becomes something that you got to work through. In the consumer space, I think it's a little bit easier to push things out and people say, hey, I'm going to try it. And if I like it, I'll use it. And if I don't like it, I'm okay with it. And people have that expectation. In organizations, you go through multiple levels every time, you make that change or you push out something new, and it slows it down and it forces you to be more deliberate with the things and being able to have that impact that you want to have.
Mhm.
So it's a different pace and you just have to think about it. My experience is you have to think about it differently.
Well, with that, on that topic, how would you say that AI is changing, what it takes to grow a product now? I mean, I feel like we're recording this in 2026, and in the early part of the year, it may be totally different next year. But right now, what do you feel like the impact is?
So it's a few things. I think the expectations have shot up. I think most people have, or many people have some experience with AI at this point, right? Whether it's ChatGPT or vibe coding apps. A lot of organizations in 2025 had an internal AI initiative and they got people to use it. They may have, larger organizations, they may have spun up their own internal AI. And that sets the bar pretty high where, a quick and simple chat interface just doesn't cut it anymore, right? It's just not enough. A lot of the old challenges actually still exist, right? And that's the interesting thing. Especially again in the large organizations, the infosec bar has also been raised, right? They
Mhm.
want to vet it inside and out before you go forward.
Yeah.
You may be able to build it relatively quickly. The ongoing support costs of something that's non-deterministic, right? That's constantly changing and evolving on you,
Yeah.
and when the bar keeps moving is actually high. So this idea of, I like to think of a product as a surface area a little bit. And as you add features, that surface area gets bigger.
Mhm.
If you're trying to maintain that same surface area with the same number of people, but it keeps getting bigger and bigger, you can kind of see where that becomes difficult.
Yeah.
And
The bubble
AI
pops.
actually, yeah, yeah. And AI really, I think, expands the surface area in a way that many teams haven't wrapped their head around yet,
Mhm.
because there's a lot that happens later on downstream that aren't obvious when the head of sales or the CEO vibe code a project, or a prototype
Yeah.
on Saturday afternoon and come back on Monday and say,
Yeah.
hey, can we have this?
Yeah. And that's it must be so hard for people because it's very easy to make something look great right now on the surface. But I don't know of anyone vibe coding enterprise ready, secure, maintainable stuff today. So definitely changes things.
Vibe coding, it's a tremendous opportunity and it's really great for product, especially product
Yeah.
managers.
Mhm.
In a lot of ways, the early vibe coded stuff, similarities to, people saying, hey, I'm just going to build a quick spreadsheet for this, right? Those spreadsheets were
Yes.
not necessarily durable goods. They might get used for 3 months and
Yeah.
then move on to the next one.
Yeah.
And a lot of the coded projects, obviously, they look a lot better and they're,
That's a great analogy, actually. I really like that.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really like solving a quick problem versus we're going to use this operating model for how we deploy capital next year. You're not doing that so quick.
Right. Build everything around a spreadsheet that someone built, over the weekend for a presentation on Monday.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for the conversation. For people that want to learn more about you, where should we send them?
Yeah, you can send them to my LinkedIn. I'm doing advising and fractional work at the moment, really helping teams to kind of get to unblock themselves and move forward. A lot of the work that I do, most of the work I do is with kind of growing early to mid stage companies. And, I'd love to help.
Love it. Thank you so much.